Cool. So my name's Dave. I've recently been working out in Australia for a company called Campaign Monitor, and I'm now over here working for them remotely. When I'm not working for them, I'm just delving into anything kind of new and shiny coming out. Hugely passionate about the web and trying to push it forward. And most recently, I've been delving into all things Shadow DOM. So I should probably start this talk with a confession. I was talking about this in Sydney probably at the beginning of the year, and talk went really well, or so I thought, and it turned out there were 5 guys from the W3 working group there, specifically guys that were working on the Shadow DOM spec, and they're all queued up by the side of the stage when I'm finished. I'm like, oh, here we go. Like, oh yeah, it was a great talk, man. Like, you know, really enjoyed the way you were explaining the Shadow DOM. It was really simple and understandable. And I was feeling pretty good with myself, feeling pretty chuffed. But the last half, yeah, we're axing all of that, or it's being deprecated. So you've just shared a pack of lies to all these people here. And I guess that's one of the risks when you are talking about new features that aren't fully implemented across browsers yet. And I was talking to a guy at a conference recently, and he said, you know, as soon as the speaker tells me that the browser support isn't across the board and I can't use it yet, I just switch off. And I learned 2 things then. The first was, I think fundamentally that's the wrong attitude. Like, we come to these kind of conferences to find out what is coming out there and what is coming up. And we're quite privileged to work in an environment and with technology that is constantly evolving and where we can constantly learn. And so I'd ask you to keep an open mind. The other thing was, I'm not going to tell you what the browser support is to the end, so you don't switch off right at the beginning. So first of all, if I could just get a quick show of hands, who is using Shadow DOM in production right now? Oh wow, we have a guy. So if I get anything wrong, ask that guy over there. And who's heard of it but hasn't really done anything with it yet? Cool, yeah, a few hands. And who literally has 0 idea what I'm going on about whatsoever? All right, cool, a few. Well, some of you might have used it unknowingly. The browser vendors have actually been using it for a while with the video and audio elements, so if you've ever used either of those, then you've actually unwillingly been a Shadow DOM user. So why Shadow DOM at all? Well, personally, I'm sick of writing code for the same components over and over again from project to project. What I want to be able to do is create reusable components that I can use on several projects, or even better, package up and share them with other developers and have them be able to use them in their projects. Now, it seems like componentization has been one of the topics of the day. We've had some awesome talks on Sass and CSS modules and achieving them that way. But you often find with those that it's great for newer code bases, but it doesn't stop existing styles, say scope to element selectors like button, from bleeding into your nicely new button class that you've generated. And it's not our fault, you know. We're all smart guys and girls. Nobody comes out thinking, oh, yeah, I'm going to make a real hash of this CSS today. But invariably, we end up going back to a project, maybe even 6 months later, and you're like, oh, man, I hate myself right now. What was I thinking when I wrote this? And I was guilty of this. When I first started out, I used to write websites, just sort of freelance development. And I prided myself on using no classes for styling whatsoever. Everything was scope to element selectors. You look at my HTML and it's just button, div. And I was like, wow, look how clean that markup is. I am a god among men. And of course, it wasn't remotely scalable, and I started working on larger web applications, and someone else wanted to put a button in, and it just ruined everything. And that's one of the fundamental problems that we have with CSS, is that everything is global, there's no style encapsulation, we end up with specificity conflicts, and it's really tough to get rid of unused and dead code. So a few years ago, I started to hear about web components, got really excited, and totally forgot about them. And it seems that a lot of people had. So as a quick reminder, effectively, there are W3 specifications that enable just this, for you to be able to build your own reusable components to share with other developers. A good use case for them would be building pieces of UI like notifications or other things that you're using all the time that you want to be able to share with other developers or use across product projects. So for this talk, I'm going to talk specifically about one of those specs, which is the Shadow DOM. And I prefer to lead by example, so I'm going to give an example of a notification notification component so you can understand sort of where I'm coming from. So here we have a pretty ugly looking notification component in blue. I've also just chucked an H3 and a button in there so that you can see the difference in the styles. Now, a notification is a component I tend to use fairly regularly. The component itself, it's got a heading. Up here, it's got an action button down here. The contrast isn't great, my bad, but there's no accessibility experts in here. My close cross and timestamp. Now, I find when I'm doing notifications, I often need the close button, the timestamp, similar kind of format, but the rest of this content here might vary. It might not be an action button. It might do something else entirely. So what I want to do is build this notification component with some elements that are customizable by the consumer and some that are hidden away. So the first thing that I do is write up the markup for the stuff that should be customizable. I'm going to try not to bombard you with too much code. So this is a fairly straightforward notification component. I've just got a div with an ID of notification. It's not for styling, it's just so I can attach some JavaScript. I know it's CSS, but... and yeah, my heading, my title, and my reply button. Pretty straightforward stuff. I've deliberately left it classless to demonstrate the encapsulation side of things that the shadow DOM gives us. And so how does that render? Pretty sexy. Well, it looks ugly. It doesn't do anything yet. But now what I'm going to do is add the close button and the notification timestamp, my constants that I want always to be there for whoever's consuming this component. And I want them tucked away so that the consumer doesn't have to worry about them. Heads up, there is going to be 3 lines of JavaScript in this talk. So here they are. I'll try and get them over and done with as quickly as possible. So we've got a variable of notification, which is just grabbing the element by ID that I showed you in the previous slide. The create shadow root. Now this has been deprecated and has been replaced by attach shadow. But no browsers currently support attach shadow, so if you want to mess about with it today, you temporarily have to use create shadow root. And what that does is that creates a node in which you can then hide things away in the shadow. So by using root.innerHTML, hold the door, that will then get tucked away inside the shadows. So I'll show you what that looks like inside DevTools. The dark theme here was in one of Umar's emails, which I found out how to do earlier. So you'll see here, it's rendered out the markup from here. So it's got the shadow DOM heading, the click me button. But this is the bit we're really interested in. You have the ID of notification, and there's this new shadow root, which you may not have seen before. And inside that, that's got our string that we tucked away inside. This is just an example of it when I was saying that other browser vendors have been doing it for a while. So this is the audio element. You'll see that they've always had this available, and now it's finally something that we as developers can also make use of. So back to my example. That's all well and good, but putting a string inside the shadows isn't really that useful on its own. So let's add some content to it. So instead, inside my inner HTML, I'm going to chuck a button, which is going to form our close button, and a p tag, which should probably be a date tag semantically, but I want to show the difference between 2 p's later on, so forgive me on the semantic side. And this new element, which you probably haven't, well, potentially haven't seen before, which is the content element. And if any of you ever used Angular before or something similar to that, it's similar to the transclude ability that it has, where it can suck content away inside it. So, jumping back into DevTools, you'll now see inside our content, it's actually rendering the H3, the P, and the button, which are the 3 elements that we declared earlier on. And you can see they've now been pulled away and tucked inside. That's the information that our component consumer has provided us with. And we'll see how that renders. Okay, so we've got an extra close button and our timestamp down the bottom. The content tag has been deprecated and has been replaced with slots, which effectively is doing the same thing. It just uses the word slot instead of content. Not currently supported, so if you do want to mess about with it, you need to use content for now and then switch it over for slot when that becomes available. Slot does also give us another couple of cool features though. So for example here, you can declare a slot of heading and a slot of action, and you can then actually pass in specifically where you want that to render in the markup, so it does give the consumer a little bit more control. And it will still render exactly the same. So how do we actually style this? How do we actually make this component look a bit more how we want it to look? So at the most basic level, we have the host selector, which again we need to tuck away inside the shadow. So this, effectively you end up with one long string that contains the whole component. The host selector has the lowest specificity of anything, as low as you can go basically. So if your end user writes a class, it'll override it. Anything at all, even an element selector will override that. So it's purely just a way that you can give some basic styles to the container. So in this case, the element that had the ID of notification, that will be our host, in that it hosts the shadow DOM inside it. So those basic styles, see they basically style the blue, just giving it blue with a bit of rounded corners, nothing really too taxing. You can give it a bit of like some state hooks, for example. So you can pass in a class of isActive. So if our host element has a class of isActive, it will then apply those styles, in this case, a 10 pixel pink border, which you can probably just about see here. This then has the next lowest specificity, so that will be more specific than just using the host on its own. And tied with that is also you can use the context. So some people might want to style things inside the shadow DOM if it's inside a host element. So say, for example, you had a theme on your site and you've applied a class to the body. This is my House Terrell theme, so it's green. Then that enables that host element, if it's inside of the class House Terrell theme, to take on those styles. Now it's green and you can't read the black text and it's just horrible. But this has the same specificity as the previous selector. So it will just depend on source order in your CSS. But how do we actually style the innards? How do we actually style the content of this? Effectively, we want to reach inside the shadow root and add and style all those elements that we added before. So we can do that in the same way inside our inner HTML. So again, I've deliberately scoped my styles to the button and p tag. So of these on here, I've got 3 buttons, one up here, one here, and 2 paragraphs. Can anyone hazard a guess with the styles that I've just applied straight onto button and paragraph, which ones are actually going to take any of the styling? Except the guy who's already using Shadow DOM. Because you might think it would just style the whole lot. Anyone think it would style the whole lot? Nope. Anyone think it would just be this button? Anyone for this button? Anyone for this button? A few for that button. Anyone for this paragraph? Wow. All right. What it'll actually do, because it's tucked away inside the shadows, is purely style the close button and this paragraph here, while this button, and this paragraph get completely left alone, even though I've just used the base element selector. So with 2 other buttons on the page, another paragraph, they don't inherit the styles because it's inside the shadow DOM. And this is probably the most important thing to take away, is that styles are scoped to the shadow root by default. This is a really awesome feature, and I really urge you to take this away with you. When you're writing large CSS architectures, having this concept of scope available to you and being able to encapsulate your styles inside a component can be an absolute lifesaver. But how about actually styling the content? So this is the information that the user, the consumer of your component provided to you. And this would be done using, for now, the content pseudo element, which is much the same way. So you would target content h3 and content p. And this would be just the heading and the paragraph that the consumer was writing. Again, just deliberately use the base selectors. It's now slotted. Content has been deprecated, but that does match if you think before it went from content to slot, it makes sense that the selector to style it would change from content to slotted. So they are following the same format. But no browser vendor has shipped this new version, so for now it will just be content. Looks exactly the same, as I said, just use slotted in place of content. And there we have it. It's starting to shape up a little bit more. So nothing's bleeding in or bleeding out. You can see that our heading and our button, this is all just one HTML page. There's nothing pulling in anything else from anywhere else. So even just using those base selectors, by having it all tied away, you just don't have to worry about it anymore. You can give this component to whoever, and it's all neatly packaged up. So these are 3 other selectors which you used to be able to use and are now all deprecated. So the shadow, effectively they all did similar things, which enabled your consumer to reach into just sack off everything that I just told you and just style it however the hell they wanted. And the spec writers were like, hang on, this is a terrible idea. This goes against everything that we were just writing the spec for. So I did notice in the CSS scoping specification that there is this 3-arrow one. Its official title, which you won't remember, is the Shadow Piercing Descendant Combinator. But I did see that as of the 26th of April was actually in a CSS scoping spec, so we might see it for something else. But at the moment, the reason I mention it is because they are discussed in numerous articles around the web over the last few years, and I've spent a lot of time reading about them only to find out they're them just gone. So I'm just saving you some time now. If you see them, just move on to the next article. However, it is still useful to be able to have your consumer be able to style some of it, but maybe you just want to restrict those. And so I'd like to talk quickly on custom properties, or CSS variables, as some of you might know them as. So effectively what you can do inside your component is create like an API, and again, I don't mean HTTP requests, I mean something that your component consumer can hook into in order to style certain elements that you give them access to. So here's an example of what that might look like. Inside your inner HTML, you chuck together your button SVG, and you set a fill. Has anyone seen custom properties before? Okay, cool. So effectively, they're like variables. They have this strange syntax of the double dash. You declare the variable name, and then you can also set a fallback. So effectively, if your consumer doesn't provide a close button color, it will fall back to white. If they don't provide the size, it will fall back to 1.5 rem, so on, so on, so on. So you declare all of this inside your component, and then when you hand it over to your consumer, the only things they can actually change are the things you've allowed them by referencing these variables just in their regular CSS using the root component that I was discussing earlier on. So if I set my close button to orange, my button size to 2 rem, and my text color to yellow, I've now set all my variables here, so that's going to override them. And you'll see in my finished component, and now actually, not that you'd ever want to style it this way, but you have your orange button and your yellow text. And I think that's pretty cool. The fact that we can create components and share them, but still give a little bit of control to the end user so they can't make a horrible botched job of it. But I don't know. To me, I think that's pretty fascinating. Now I'm going to give you the browser support. So everything I showed you today, I did natively in Chrome. It wasn't Chrome Canary or anything fancy. It's just there. It can all also be done in Opera. Firefox, it is behind a feature flag at the moment. Safari, it's in progress, and Edge, you have to vote for it. If you want to have a play about with it in some of those browsers without just doing it natively, there are polyfills available. So there's webcomponents.js, Polymer, and Xtag by some smart people at Mozilla and Google have put those bottom two together. And they basically polyfill the API so that you can use elements of the Shadow DOM now. Here's some useful links. So there's some good articles on Shadow DOM and web components in general. And if you want to tweet at me, that's my Twitter. And yeah, that's everything. I tweet regularly about CSS and JS, so hit me up on there. And thanks very much for having me.